"We didn't order for you," my brother said as his kids dug into $100 steaks. My son sat there with an empty plate. His wife smirked. "You should have packed snacks." I just smiled and said, "Good to know." When the waiter came back, I looked at him and said, the clatter of silverware on porcelain was the only sound I allowed myself to focus on. It was a precise, rhythmic noise. A symphony of privilege played out on my late father's dime. My brother, Mark, sawed into a piece of filet mignon that was probably worth more than my weekly grocery budget. His two children, my niece and nephew, mimicked him with practiced miniature savagery, their faces smeared with béarnaise sauce. They were digging into $100 steaks, and my son, my 7-year-old Sam, sat beside me with an empty plate, his small hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. The white expanse of ceramic in front of him was a declaration of war. It was an accusation. It was an absence so profound, it felt like a physical presence at the table. "We didn't order for you." Mark had said it so casually, a verbal shrug, as the waiter placed the plates before them. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Sam. He looked at his steak, as if its perfect medium-rare cross-section was the most fascinating thing in the world. The words hung in the air, thick and greasy like the smell of rendered beef fat. It wasn't an oversight. It was a statement, carefully crafted and delivered with the precision of a surgeon who intended to maim, not heal. My sister-in-law, Clarice, the architect of this entire miserable performance, offered a smirk that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "You should have packed snacks, Leo," she chimed in, her voice a saccharine poison. "You know how these places can be, and with your situation." She let the word hang there. Situation, a euphemism for my 5 years of hard-won sobriety, for my single-parent status, for the financial tightrope I walked every single day since my wife passed. She wielded my struggles like a weapon, and tonight she was twisting the blade. I felt Sam flinch beside me, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He was trying to be brave, trying to be the little man I was always telling him he was. But I saw the tremor in his lower lip, the sheen of moisture in his big brown eyes. He was hungry, yes, but more than that, he was confused. He was hurt. He adored his Uncle Mark, idolized his older cousins. And in this opulent, wood-paneled room, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 celebratory dinners our family had shared here over the years, he was being told, in no uncertain terms, that he did not belong, that he was not wanted. Rage, hot and familiar, coiled in my gut. It was an old friend, a dangerous companion I had learned to keep locked away. For 5 years I had starved it, denied it, meditated it into submission. I could feel it rattling the bars of its cage now, begging to be let out. It wanted to scream. It wanted to flip the heavy oak table. It wanted to grab my brother by his bespoke collar and ask him what kind of man, what kind of brother, does this to his own blood in front of a child. But I couldn't. Giving in to that rage was exactly what Clarice wanted. It would be the proof she was so desperate to manufacture, that I was unstable, unreliable, the same reckless mess I had been half a decade ago. Proof that I was an unfit father. So I took a breath. I felt the burn in my lungs, the frantic pounding in my chest. I looked across the table, past my brother's deliberate ignorance, and met Clarice's triumphant gaze. I gave her nothing. Not the anger she craved, not the hurt she expected. I just smiled, a thin, tight curve of my lips that felt more like a snarl. "Good to know," I said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of stones in the sudden silence. Mark faltered, his fork halfway to his mouth. Clarice's smirk flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty crossing her features. They had expected a scene. I gave them 2 words of chilling civility. I turned my attention to my son. I placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear. "How about you and I order the biggest, most ridiculously expensive thing on the menu, my treat?" His eyes lit up, the hurt momentarily forgotten and replaced by the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child promised a feast. He nodded, a small, hopeful bob of his head. I felt a surge of love so fierce it almost buckled me. He was the reason. He was the only reason any of this mattered. I would walk through fire for him. I would face down 1,000 Clarices. The waiter, a tall man with kind eyes and an air of unflappable professionalism, had been hovering nearby, sensing the tension. He'd seen it all before, I was sure. The quiet cruelties of the wealthy, the family dramas played out over overpriced wine and appetizers. He approached the table with a practiced neutrality. "Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" he asked, his gaze directed at Mark, the presumed host. Before Mark could answer, I caught the waiter's eye. I held his gaze for a beat, letting him see the steel in mine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just smiled that same cold smile. When the waiter came back, I looked at him and said, "My son and I will be ordering now. We'll have 2 of the Wagyu tomahawks, rare, and a side of the truffle macaroni and cheese, a large one. Also, my brother and his family will be covering our check this evening. Please put our order on a separate ticket, bring it to me to approve and sign, but the final charge goes to the card used to hold this reservation. I believe you have it on file under his name." The silence that followed was absolute. Mark's fork clattered onto his plate. Clarice's jaw went slack, the mask of smug superiority momentarily gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. My niece and nephew just stared, their mouths full of half-chewed steak. The waiter didn't even blink. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, sir. An excellent choice," he said, and with a quiet quiet turn, he was gone. I turned back to my son and gave him a wink. He giggled, a sound of pure relief that was music to my soul. The power dynamic at the table had shifted. It was a small victory, a petty one, perhaps, but it was a start. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't lost control. I had used their own rules, their own world of assumptions and financial leverage against them. And in Clarice's eyes, I saw something new. Not just triumph, not just contempt. I saw a flicker of genuine fear. She had poked the bear one too many times, and she was just beginning to realize it wasn't sleeping anymore. This dinner, this cruel, calculated act of humiliation, wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was going to burn her world to the ground. The meal that followed was the most uncomfortable I have ever endured. The steaks arrived, magnificent and obscene, sizzling on their platters. Sam's eyes were like saucers. He ate with the gusto of a boy who had been starving, and in many ways, he had been. He'd been starved of the simple kindness he deserved from his family. I ate slowly, methodically, making a point of savoring every bite, all while holding Clarice's furious glare. Mark wouldn't look at me at all. He shoveled food into his mouth, his face a mask of dull red, a puppet whose strings had been cut. He was a coward. I had always known it, but had never wanted to believe it. He was my brother, my only brother. We had grown up sharing a room, covering for each other, fighting for each other. Now he sat across from me, a stranger, a willing accomplice to his wife's venom. The bill arrived as promised. The waiter presented it to me on a small silver tray. I scanned the total, a truly astronomical figure, and then I signed my name with a flourish. I handed the leather folder back to the waiter. "Please charge this to the reservation holder," I said, my voice clear and steady. The waiter nodded and departed. A few moments later, I saw him approach Mark with the credit card machine. I didn't watch the transaction. I didn't need to. The image of Clarice's face, a rictus of fury and disbelief, was satisfaction enough. We left without saying goodbye. I held Sam's hand, and we walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air. He was buzzing, high on sugar, from the molten chocolate lava cake he'd devoured for dessert and the thrill of the forbidden. He didn't understand the specifics of what had happened, but he understood the shift. He knew that his dad had stood up for him. That was enough. As I drove us home, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. This wasn't just about a dinner. Clarice was methodical. She was a planner. This public humiliation was a move in a much larger game, and I had a sickening feeling that I was only just beginning to understand the rules. For years, she had been dropping little poison pellets of doubt into the family well, little comments about my fragility, questions about my ability to handle the stress of single fatherhood, suggestions that Sam might be better off in a more stable, two-parent home. I had dismissed it as cattiness, as the petty jealousies of a woman who seemed to resent the close bond I had with my father. Now I saw it for what it was, a campaign. My father had passed away 6 months ago. His death was sudden, a massive heart attack that had left us all reeling. He had been the family's center of gravity, a quiet, steady presence who loved his sons and his grandchildren fiercely. He was also a very wealthy man. His will was to be read the following week, and suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Clarice didn't just want to humiliate me. She wanted to disinherit me. She wanted to prove I was an unstable addict, an unfit parent, incapable of managing an inheritance or, God forbid, my own child. The restaurant was a test, a provocation designed to make me explode, to create a public spectacle they could use as ammunition. My calm, calculated response had not been part of her plan. When we got home, I put a sleepy Sam to bed, tucking him in and kissing his forehead. He was already half asleep, murmuring about the giant steak. I watched him for a long moment, my heart aching. He was my world. The thought of anyone, especially Clarice, trying to take him from me, filled me with a terror so profound it was paralyzing. But fear was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was time to fight back. I went to my father's old study, a room I had barely touched since his death. It was just as he had left it. Books on law and history lining the walls, a faint scent of pipe tobacco and old paper in the air. I sat down at his heavy mahogany desk and turned on the computer. For years, my father had paid me to manage his personal finances and investments. It was a way for him to help me out when I was struggling to get back on my feet without it feeling like charity. I still had all the passwords, all the access codes. Mark and Clarice didn't know this. They assumed, I suppose, that our father had a team of accountants at his firm handling everything. They underestimated me. Everyone always had. I started with the family trust accounts, specifically the educational funds Dad had set up for each of his grandchildren. My hands were shaking as I typed in the passwords. I navigated to the transaction histories, my breath catching in my throat, and there it was. For the past 2 years, there had been a series of small, regular withdrawals from Sam's account. Not large amounts, nothing that would have triggered an automatic alert. A few $100s here, 1,000 there. Each one was coded as educational expenses or tutor fees, but I had never hired a tutor. I paid for his school supplies out of my own pocket. I kept digging, my blood running cold. The transfers were all going to the same place, a checking account under the name CM Enterprises. Clarice's maiden name was Miller, CM Clarice Miller. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a shell corporation, a ghost account. She had been systematically stealing from my son's college fund. It wasn't just about the money, it was the sheer, calculated cruelty guilty of it. She was stealing a child's future. But that wasn't the worst of it. I moved from the bank records to the cloud server where my father backed up his personal documents. I searched for Clarice's name. A folder popped up, password protected. I tried her birthday, their anniversary, her children's names. Nothing. Then, on a hunch, I typed in the name of her childhood dog, a creature she was morbidly attached to. Access granted. The folder contained only a handful of files, but they were devastating. There were email chains between Clarice and a man named Arthur Vance, a notoriously sleazy family law attorney known for his scorched earth custody battles. The subject lines were things like guardianship inquiry and challenging parental fitness. I opened the most recent one. My vision blurred as I read. Clarice was outlining her case against me. She listed my DUI from 7 years ago, my stint in rehab. She mentioned my financial instability and history of erratic behavior. She had been documenting every argument, twisting every conversation, building a narrative to paint me as a monster. The dinner, she wrote, was intended to be a public demonstration of his inability to control his temper in a stressful social situation. There was more, a draft of a legal petition, a list of witnesses, family members she had been manipulating for years, people who would testify to my decline, and then the final brutal blow. I found a scanned copy of a document. It was a forged letter, supposedly from my father to his lawyer, written a month before he died. In it, he expressed grave concerns about my sobriety and my ability to care for Sam, and requested that, in the event of his death, Mark and Clarice be granted temporary guardianship of my son and control over my portion of the inheritance until I could prove sustained stability. The signature was a near-perfect forgery of my father's hand. I felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't just a plan to disinherit me, it was a conspiracy to steal my son. The rage I had suppressed at the restaurant came back, but it was different now. It wasn't hot and explosive, it was ice. It was a cold, pure, diamond-hard fury that clarified everything. I was no longer just a victim of her cruelty. I was a man with evidence. I saved everything. I copied the files onto a secure, encrypted hard drive. I took screenshots of the bank transfers. I printed every email, every document, every last poisonous word. The stack of paper grew on my father's desk, a monument to her depravity. By the time the sun began to stream through the window, I had a case, a real one. I knew what I had to do. My first call wasn't to my brother. It wasn't to confront Clarice. It was to a man my father had trusted implicitly for over 40 years, Mr. Harrison, his estate lawyer. "I need to see you," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's about my father's will, and it's about my son." Mr. Harrison's office was a time capsule from the 1970 seconds. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books that smelled of dust and wisdom, and a faint, lingering scent of his forbidden cigars. He was a man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen every form of human greed and folly. He listened to my story without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. I laid out the printed documents on his expansive desk, the bank statements showing the theft from Sam's account, the emails between Clarice and the custody lawyer, and finally, the forged letter. He examined the letter last, holding it up to the light, his expression grim. He pulled a file from his cabinet, one of my father's old legal documents, and compared the signatures. "It's good," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Damn good, but it's not his. The pressure on the downstroke is wrong. Your father had a lighter hand." He looked at me, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Your sister-in-law is playing a very dangerous game, Leo. This is fraud. This is conspiracy. This is beyond a simple family squabble." I just nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. I hadn't slept. The cold fury had carried me through the night. But now, in the safety of this quiet office, the enormity of it all was crashing down. "What do I do, Mr. Harrison? She's trying to take my son." "You do exactly what you've been doing," he said, his voice firm. "You stay calm. You stay sober. You document everything. And you let me handle the legal side. The will reading is on Tuesday. Be there. You and your son. Do not speak to your brother or his wife before then. No calls, no texts, nothing. Let them think they've won. Let them walk into that room full of confidence. Arrogance is a fatal flaw, and from the looks of this," he gestured to the pile of evidence, "your sister-in-law is fatally afflicted." The next few days were an exercise in supreme self-control. I felt like I was living in a bubble, going through the motions of life. I took Sam to school, helped him with his homework, read him bedtime stories. Every moment with him felt precious, freighted with the terrifying possibility of loss. He knew something was wrong. "Are you sad about Grandpa?" he asked one night, his small face etched with concern. I pulled him into a hug, burying my face in his hair. "Yeah, buddy," I whispered. "I'm very sad about Grandpa, but I'm okay. We're going to be okay." My phone buzzed incessantly with texts from Mark. At first, they were angry. "What the hell was that at the restaurant? You owe me for that dinner." Then, as I continued to ignore him, they turned manipulative, feigning concern. "Leo, seriously, call me. Clarice and I are worried about you. This isn't like you. Are you drinking again?" Each message was a little dagger, a calculated twist of the knife. He was building his own paper trail, trying to establish a narrative of my instability. I saved every single text, adding it to the growing file on my encrypted drive. I spent hours on the phone with my sponsor, David. He was a retired cop, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had somehow come out the other side with his soul intact. He didn't offer legal advice. He offered something more important, a lifeline to my sanity. "This is is her disease talking, Leo, he'd say, referring to Clarice's venomous behavior. It's a sickness of the spirit. Your job isn't to cure her. Your job is to protect yourself and your boy. Stay in your own hula hoop, go to a meeting, breathe, one day at a time. His calm, steady voice was an anchor in the storm of my anxiety. I also made an appointment with a therapist, a woman who specialized in trauma and family dynamics. The first session was just a raw outpouring of everything I had been holding in. The grief for my father, the betrayal by my brother, the terror of losing my son, the shame of my past mistakes that were now being used as a weapon against me. She listened, she validated, and she gave me tools. Grounding techniques, breathing exercises, ways to detach from the emotional manipulation. She helped me see that Clarice's campaign wasn't really about me. It was about her own deep-seated insecurities and greed. I was just a convenient target. Building this support network, Mr. Harrison, David, my therapist, was like assembling an army. Each one provided a different kind of armor. Legal, spiritual, psychological. I felt less alone, less like a single man fighting a tidal wave. I was preparing for battle, and for the first time since that horrible dinner, I started to believe I might actually win. The day of the will reading arrived. I dressed carefully, in a suit my father had bought for me 2 years ago to celebrate my 3rd anniversary of sobriety. It still fit perfectly. I helped Sam get into a little blazer and tie. He looked so small, so serious. Why do we have to go to Mr. Harrison's office, Dad? He asked, struggling with his collar. Because Grandpa left us a letter, I said, my voice softer than I intended, and he wanted us to be there to hear it. It was the simplest way I could explain it. As we walked into the waiting room, I saw them, Mark and Clarice. They were sitting on the leather sofa, looking smug and confident. Clarice was wearing a black designer dress, a portrait of somber elegance. She gave me a look of pity, the kind one reserves for a wounded animal you're about to put out of its misery. Mark just looked uncomfortable, refusing to meet my eyes. Mr. Harrison's secretary showed us into the conference room. We all took our seats around the long, polished table. The air was thick with tension. Mr. Harrison entered, carrying a single, sealed envelope. He cleared his throat. We are gathered today for the reading of the last will and testament of my client and dear friend, Jonathan Price, he began, his voice formal and grave. He broke the seal and began to read. The initial parts were standard, bequests to charities, provisions for his longtime housekeeper. Then he got to the main inheritances. He announced that the family home was to be sold, with the proceeds divided equally between his 2 sons. My heart sank a little. I had hoped to keep the house, the place where Sam and I had so many happy memories. Clarice shot me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had won. But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. Regarding the remainder of the estate, he continued, his voice taking on a new weight, including all liquid assets, stocks, bonds, and investment portfolios. My client has made a specific and, I must say, unusual stipulation. He paused, looking over his glasses at each of us in turn. The estate is to be placed into a single trust. My son, Leo, is to be the primary beneficiary. He will receive a generous monthly stipend, and the trustee will have discretion to release larger sums for the care and education of my grandson, Samuel, and for Leo's own well-being and business ventures. Clarice gasped. Mark's head snapped up, his face a mask of disbelief. What? He stammered. That can't be right. Dad and I talked about this. It was supposed to be a 50-50 split. Please allow me to finish, Mark, Mr. Harrison said, his tone icy. He continued reading from the will. My son, Mark, will also receive a monthly stipend from this trust, equal to 1/4 of the amount dispersed to Leo. The room erupted. 1/4? Clarice shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. That's insane! He's the older son. He's the stable one. This is a joke. Mr. Harrison held up a hand for silence. There is one final clause, he said, his eyes locking on Clarice. It is what we call a malicious interference, or in terrorem clause. It states, and I quote, should any beneficiary, or the spouse of any beneficiary, be found to have taken malicious action to deliberately undermine another beneficiary, to alienate me from my family, or to manipulate the disposition of my estate through deceit or fraud, that beneficiary's share of the trust shall be immediately and permanently reduced to a token sum of $1 per year. He let the words hang in the dead air of the room. I felt a slow smile spread across my face. My father, he had known. He had seen what Clarice was, what she was doing, long before I had. This wasn't just a will, it was a trap. A perfectly crafted, posthumous trap, and Clarice had just walked right into it. This is ridiculous. Clarice was on her feet now, her face blotchy with rage. Leo has clearly manipulated him. He's an addict. He probably coerced him into signing this. We will be contesting this, I assure you. We have evidence of his instability. We even have a letter from Jonathan himself expressing his concerns. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I looked at Mr. Harrison, and he gave me a slight nod. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. I stood up and placed it on the table with a soft thud. Are you referring to this letter, Clarice? I asked, my voice dangerously calm, as I slid the forged document across the table toward her. Her eyes widened in shock. And as for evidence, I continued, my voice growing stronger with every word, I have some of my own. I opened the folder. Here are the bank statements from Sam's Educational Trust, showing 2 years of illegal withdrawals funneled into a shell corporation registered in your maiden name. Here are the printouts of your emails with Arthur Vance, plotting to strip me of my parental rights. And here, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, is a sworn affidavit from a forensic handwriting expert confirming that the signature on that letter is a forgery. The color drained from Clarice's face. She stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Mark looked from the documents to his wife, his expression a mixture of confusion and horror. Clarice, he said, his voice weak. What is this? What has she done, Leo? She has committed fraud, Mark, Mr. Harrison said, his voice like the crack of a gavel. She has stolen from your nephew. She has conspired to subvert your father's final wishes, and she has done it all using you as her shield. Pursuant to the terms of the will, I am now legally obligated to open an investigation, and I feel it is my duty to inform you both that the evidence Leo has compiled is more than sufficient to trigger the malicious interference clause. Furthermore, it is likely grounds for criminal charges. Clarice sank back into her chair, all the fight gone out of her. She looked small and pathetic, a cornered animal. Mark just stared at me, his eyes pleading. Leo, I didn't know, he stammered. I swear, I didn't know about any of this. I just thought she said you were struggling. I looked at my brother, at the man I had once loved more than anyone, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, just a vast, empty coldness. You didn't want to know, Mark, I said quietly. It was easier for you to believe I was a screw-up than to believe your wife was a monster. You chose. You made your choice a long time ago. I turned to my son, who had been watching the whole exchange with wide, unblinking eyes. I knelt down beside him. Come on, buddy, I said softly. Let's go home. And, with Mr. Harrison's promise to be in touch hanging in the air, I took my son's hand and walked out, leaving the ruins of my old family behind me. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal maneuvering. Clarice, predictably, hired an aggressive lawyer who immediately went on the attack. They filed motions to have the will thrown out, claiming undue influence on my part and citing my father's diminished capacity in his final months. They tried to paint me as a manipulative, recovering addict who had taken advantage of a grieving old man. It was a character assassination of the highest order, and it was brutal. My entire life was put under a microscope. My past was dredged up and twisted into a grotesque caricature. The DUI from my early 20s became evidence of a lifelong pattern of recklessness. My time in rehab was framed not as a successful recovery, but as a sign of inherent instability. Every argument I'd ever had with my father was reinterpreted as a sign of my volatile nature. They deposed old family friends, distant relatives, anyone they thought might have a negative story to tell. It was a smear campaign designed to break me, to make me so emotionally exhausted that I would just give up and settle. The pressure was immense. Some family members, aunts and uncles who had always been swayed by Clarice's charm began to call me. They urged me to be reasonable, to think of the family, to work something out with Mark. They didn't see the evidence I had. They only heard Clarice's narrative. Poor, stable Mark being cheated out of his rightful inheritance by his troubled younger brother. I was being gaslit by my own extended family, and the isolation was crushing. There were nights I would lie awake, the old cravings whispering at the edge of my consciousness, telling me there was an easy way to make the pain stop. But then I would look at Sam, sleeping peacefully in his bed, and I would find my strength again. He was my anchor. My sobriety was my shield. David, my sponsor, was on the phone with me daily. Let them throw their mud, Leo, he'd say. It won't stick because it's not the truth. You just keep your side of the street clean. That's all you can do. My therapist helped me process the emotional onslaught, to see their attacks for what they were, the desperate flailings of guilty people. She taught me to separate my past self, the man who had made those mistakes, from the man I was today. Mr. Harrison was a rock. He countered every one of their motions with calm, methodical precision. He hired a forensic accountant who produced a devastatingly detailed report on Clarice's theft, tracing the money from Sam's account through her shell corporation and into payments for her luxury car and designer handbags. He got a sworn statement from my father's primary care physician, a man who had seen him the day before he died and testified that he was of perfectly sound mind. The most powerful piece of our case, however, came from an unexpected source. My uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, called me one afternoon. He was a quiet man, a retired history professor who had always kept his distance from family drama. I heard what Clarice is saying about you and your father, he said, his voice heavy. It's a lie, Leo. Your dad was so proud of you. He told me so himself many times. He went on to tell me that my father had confided in him about Clarice months before he died. Dad had noticed her manipulative behavior, her constant attempts to isolate him from me, her subtle digs at my recovery. He hadn't known the extent of it, the theft or the forgery, but he had known something was deeply wrong. He told me, Uncle Robert said, his voice cracking with emotion. I'm worried about Mark. That woman has her hooks in him so deep, I don't think he knows which way is up anymore. I have to protect Leo and the boy. He knew, Leo. He knew he had to protect you. Uncle Robert agreed to testify. His statement, coming from my father's own brother, was a powerful rebuttal to their narrative. He was our star witness. The turning point came when Mr. Harrison filed a motion to compel Clarice to provide a handwriting sample under court supervision. Her lawyer fought it tooth and nail, but the judge granted it. A week later, they suddenly dropped their contest of the will. They knew the game was up. The forgery was a crime, and she was not willing to risk a perjury charge on top of it. They offered a settlement. They would agree to the terms of the will, provided I agreed not to press criminal charges for the the theft and the forgery. I wrestled with the decision. A part of me, the part that still burned with cold rage, wanted to see her in handcuffs. I wanted public consequences for her private evils. I discussed it with Mr. Harrison and my therapist. You can pursue it, Mr. Harrison said. The district attorney would likely take the case, but it would be a long, ugly, and very public trial. Your son would be dragged through it. Is that a price you're willing to pay for vengeance? My therapist put it another way. What does justice look like for you, Leo? Does it look like a prison sentence for her? Or does it look like a safe, peaceful, and secure future for you and Sam, free from her influence forever? I knew they were right. The goal wasn't to destroy her. It was to protect my son. We accepted the settlement with one additional, non-negotiable condition, a permanent restraining order. Clarice was not to come within 500 feet of me or Sam. She was forbidden from contacting us in any way, directly or through a third party. Her lawyer balked, but we held firm. They finally agreed. The final meeting took place in the same conference room where the will had been read. This time, it was just the lawyers and me and Mark. Clarice wasn't there. She was legally barred from the building. Mark looked like a ghost. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He tried to speak to me before the meeting started. Leo, I am so sorry, he began, his voice a broken whisper. I was a fool. I was blind. She twisted everything. I never would have, if I had known. I held up a hand to stop him. I looked at my brother, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of the old bond, a deep, sorrowful pang of loss for what we once had. But it was gone. The trust had been shattered into a million pieces, and it could never be put back together. I know you're sorry, Mark, I said, and I meant it. I believed he was sorry now that he had been caught, now that he was paying the price. But being sorry doesn't change what you did. You stood by and watched while she tried to destroy my life. You held the knife while she twisted it. You let her humiliate my son. I can't forget that. I can't forgive it. Not now. Maybe not ever. I wish you well. But we're done. He recoiled as if I had struck him. He opened his mouth to say something else, but his lawyer put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. We signed the papers in silence. The legal battle was over. The aftermath was quiet. The big, dramatic victory I had imagined felt more like a quiet, weary truce. Justice had been served, but it was a messy, incomplete kind of justice. Clarice would never face a criminal court for what she did. Mark had lost his inheritance and his brother, but he was still a free man. The scars of their betrayal would remain with me forever. I used the inheritance to create a new life for us. I sold my father's large, empty house and bought a smaller, cozier one in a different town, a place with good schools and a strong sense of community, a place with no memories of them. I invested the rest of the money carefully, ensuring that Sam's future and ours was secure. I continued with my therapy, working through the layers of trauma, grief, and anger. I went to my meetings, shared my story, and found strength in the shared experience of others who were fighting their own battles. I established firm and permanent boundaries. The restraining order against Clarice was the easiest part. The harder part was dealing with the rest of the family. I sent a single, joint email to all my aunts, uncles, and cousins. I laid out the facts, calmly and without emotion. I told them what had happened, what Clarice had done, and the legal outcome. I ended it by saying, I love you all, but my priority is the safety and well-being of my son. If you choose to maintain a relationship with Mark and Clarice, I understand. But I cannot allow anyone in my life who believes their lies or makes excuses for their behavior. The door to my life is open, but it is not a revolving one. Some of them never spoke to me again. Others called, ashamed, and apologized for doubting me. My relationship with them is different now, more cautious, but it is honest. Uncle Robert became a regular presence in our lives, a grandfather figure to Sam, a quiet, steady source of support for me. One evening, about a year after it was all over, Sam and I were at a local diner. It was a simple place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. We were eating cheeseburgers and milkshakes. It was a world away from the opulent steakhouse where our nightmare had begun. Sam was laughing, telling me a long, convoluted story about a video game. He was happy. He was safe. He felt secure. Watching him, I realized that this was what the victory looked like. It wasn't about the money or the legal win. It wasn't about revenge. It was this quiet, ordinary, peaceful moment. The ability to sit in a restaurant with my son and not have to look over my shoulder. The freedom from manipulation and fear. The knowledge that I had faced the worst and had not only survived, but had built something better on the other side. The scars were there, deep and permanent, a roadmap of the battle I had fought. But they no longer ached. They were just a part of me now, a reminder of the strength I never knew I had. And in that noisy, wonderful, ordinary diner, I finally felt at peace. The future was ours, and we could order whatever we wanted.